Crize multe, soluții puține. Uniunea Europeană are probleme cu resursele energetice, iar de aici pot rezulta o serie de situații care riscă să afecteze la nivel general unitatea blocului comunitar. Dacă liderii politici sunt sinceri cu cetățenii și bine conciliați ca să găsească cele mai bune soluții, atunci Europa democrată ar dovedi încă o dată că rămâne cea mai creativă și mai stabilă regiune de pe glob. Emmanuel Dupuy este președintele Institutului pentru Perspectiva de Securitate Europeană. Discutăm împreună despre cum este să trăim în 27 de țări, dar să luăm o singură decizie. Sunt Cristina Cileacu, începe Pașaport diplomatic. Emmanuel Dupuy, President of the Institute for Perspective and Security in Europe, welcome to Diplomatic Passport.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Europe is facing three crises, as the head of the European diplomacy said: energy, the increased inflation, so prices, and the war. Do you think that citizens of Europe, especially Western Europe, people that have a very high standard of living, will make it through this crisis?
Yes, because the European Union is resilient and the European citizens have been prepared. They have been prepared through a certain number of speeches, a certain number of political postures. Joseph Borrell, the head of the European External Action Service, mentioned the three crises, but he could have added that these three crises do not have the same meaning from one country to the other, and it's not because only of the war in Ukraine. He spoke about the energy crisis, he spoke about the price, the increase of price, and he spoke about the war. But the crisis was there before. The increase of oil prices, the increase of gas prices, and of course this impact on the winter to come is not only due to the crisis in Ukraine, but of the blur economical position that some countries have done. Germany got quit of its nuclear plants starting from 2012, and France has started to put the same perspective. Nevertheless, 77% of our energy comes from the nuclear, of our 56 nuclear plants that we have, nuclear reactors that we have. So the crisis was there, the fuel crisis or the heating crisis to come was there before. Now, as I said, European citizens are resilient as European leaders are. And of course, this may differ from one country to the other, because some countries are more dependent than others from Russian gas, 45% for Germany. France is only 17%, 100% for Slovenia, North Macedonia and other countries. So I would not say that Europe as a whole is facing the same crisis with the same environment or the same, let's say, temporality. Now, the important issue is what should we do in the future to not be in this position for the crisis to come, because there will be new crises. First of all, the Ukraine crisis is not over. Second of all, we are facing crises to come. Pandemic is not over. The energy crisis is also due to the fact that the environmental changes and the environment and the impact on climate change will impact our carbon society or carbon economy as it is by itself, as it is already. So I think what is important in what Joseph Borrell said is putting the fact that Europe is more united than expected. It has shown and is still showing a high level of union. Nevertheless, there are some differences of approach. The new Prime Minister of Bulgaria said that he wanted to renegotiate the price with Gazprom. The Prime Minister of Hungary already bought 700,000 barrels of fuel, even though we are in the sixth package of sanctions against Russia. And maybe the next to come President of the Italian Council, Giorgia Meloni, will have another position when it comes to Russia. So I think what has to be taken in consideration in regards to what Joseph Borrell said is to call for more unity.
Well, you're right. Europe showed a lot of unity till now. But let's hope it will show it further with all the exceptions you've mentioned. But in the same time, we can witness all over Europe, and I would say all over the world, there is a big gap and increasing gap between what citizens want and need and what politicians deliver. Do you think that this gap will become wider, or it will balance somehow?
Well, I think there's a core differences when it comes to democracy approach or rule-based world order. We, and Europeans, have a tendency to believe that the minimum of political endeavor or political mobilization is based on a certain number of values: democracy, rule of law, human rights, liberalism, and of course a capacity to be in a multilateral approach when it comes to diplomatic agenda. That is for liberal democracy. But you may have another way of seeing democracy.
Illiberal democracy.
Illiberal democracy, or some call it sovereign democracy, or some call it something else than democracy, based on the principle that Vladimir Putin is always putting in perspective, saying that there's an Occidental way of democracy and an other way around, or Oriental way of democracy. By the way, some Oriental democracies, such as Singapore, such as India, do not have the same perspective when it comes to the basic core principles of collective security or collective behavior. When it comes to Western Europe, we are focused on the principle which was drafted in 1992 in Copenhagen, the Copenhagen criteria, saying that we are building a strong, resistant, resilient and collaborative Europe based on these values that I mentioned: democracy, human rights and rule of law. Now, the question is, are these values sufficient to tackle the world in its disorder as it is, when 75% of the world population, when it comes to demography, is not on the same position concerning Russian aggression in Ukraine? If you take only demography, 1.4 Chinese, 1.2 Indians, and all of the emerging countries who can be considered for some democracy, India, do not share totally our way, our lifestyle and our way of thinking diplomacy. So I think it's very important to understand what is our unity and our diversity. Europe is about unity and diversity. It's about subsidiarity and as well as solidarity. I think on a diplomatic position, we are totally united when it comes to defend our values. The question you raise is about leadership. There are citizens and there are leaders of these citizens. Where do these leaders bring the citizens, or how they can manage to convince the citizens about the maybe hard and harsh decision to be taken? Emmanuel Macron, a few days ago, during his annual speech as ambassador, and a few days before, made a discourse saying that the time when France was living on its, let's say, innocence or its welfare standards is over, and we have to tackle a new situation. Economy of war, drastic reduction in regards to heating, difficult decisions to be taken considering the capacity of each household to live in the same way before the crisis in Ukraine and its economic impact, or after. So I think what is important is, do the 27 European leaders have the full leadership to convince their citizens that these decisions have to be made now, because the crisis will go worse as the months are to come. So I think what is important is the European Union in the capacity to have 27 robust leaders talking at the same level of capacity and with the same level of acceptation from the population. Emmanuel Macron was elected president, clearly elected president in last of May, but he lost the legislative election, which seemed to confirm the fact that a certain part of the French population accepts and appreciates Emmanuel Macron, but not his policy. And this weakens Emmanuel Macron, which is supposed to be the strongest European leader, taking the, of course, the exception of Olaf Scholz, which has been elected
which is also decreasing in the eyes of his own citizens.
In the eyes of Germans, is less appreciated than he was elected in September 2021.
Well, these differences between leadership of Europe and the citizens of Europe also leads to a lot of increasing populism. So this is also one of the crises that Europe has to face, and you did mention the change that is going to happen in Italy. Perhaps other countries will be in the same position. And the question is this message of we all citizens have to suffer right now for the greater good explained well enough?
Well, it depends on the country, of course. If you are in Italy, Giorgia Meloni is described inside Italy in a different way than she is perceived outside. As I said, Fratelli d'Italia is about 24–26% of the votes to come in September. If you take Fratelli d'Italia, North League of Matteo Salvini, and the Conservative Party, you have more or less 46–47% of the population considering her not as a populist, but someone who is more democratic than the technocratic government of which was represented by Mario Draghi. So populism is a perception that is not shared in the same way when you are in the old part of Europe or when you are in the new part of Europe. Of course, we have tendency to believe that Viktor Orban is a populist, that Andrzej Duda as well. And some say that Piotr Fiala, Prime Minister of Czech Republic as well. But they have been elected, democratically elected by their government. So I would be more cautious on the perception that you have humanist leaders on one side and populist leader on the other. You have in each country a very strong populist behavior amongst every, let's say, political formation. And the danger is not that you have a populist leaders, but that populism is now a core of each European society. I think populism is a problem in each part of the world, and if you take all of the leaders amongst the merging nations, well, first of all of the BRICS nations have populist leadership. This is true with South Africa, this is with Cyril Ramaphosa, this is true with Bolsonaro in Brazil, and this is true with Narendra Modi, which is not a democratic leader, which is a populist leader as well. And Narendra Modi is one of our biggest partners. I happen to know very well Africa. All of the African leaders are populists because they have not been elected totally on the same democratic rules as we tend to believe is the core of democracy and pluralism. So, and in a way, if you take midterm elections to come in the United States and the 2 years presidential run, you very well have a new or a recomer, such as Donald Trump, or someone assessing like that to run the United States. So it's very difficult to assess this question very precisely. Some believe that Emmanuel Macron is a populist as well, because Emmanuel Macron is not very democratic in the way he is not pushing the parliament to be a counter power as it should be, or at least as it has been thought during the Fifth Republic since 1958.
Let's end the discussion about Emmanuel Macron, and another thing he also mentioned at the reunion of the French ambassador. He was talking about the art of talking to everyone, referring of course to the fact that diplomats must talk with everyone. He was referring to the Russians mainly, and he mentioned that not only for France but also for Europe it would be an issue to have only Turkey as a negotiator or a mediator between Ukrainians and Russians, and maybe other European countries like France, for instance, should get involved. How do you think the relationship between European Union and Russia, that it's still belonging to Putin, should look like?
Well, first we have to be quite sure that there's no turning back, and that the situation after the 24th of this February will not come back as it was before. That
it's impossible. I mean,
it's impossible to have normal relations after what happened after 6 months of, well, almost starting 7 months of war in Ukraine. So Russia is no longer a peer partner. It will never come back to G8, as Americans wanted to do in 2019, asking France to invite Vladimir Putin. And of course, Russia is it's an adversary, systemic adversary, and of course this is important as it is also confirming the fact that when it comes to China, Turkey and other countries, a liberal democracy, if you may, we should have the same perspective on the same narrative. That does not mean we should not speak to them. The art of democracy, the art of diplomacy, as you mentioned, at least during the Westphalian era, since 1648, since the big diplomatic conferences, 1815 in Vienna, 1914 to 1923, after the First World War, from Versailles to Lugano or elsewhere, is about speaking to parties who do not share the same values, who do not have the same perspective, and who do not have the same mindset. Diplomacy is not only speaking to partners, that is only economical cooperation. So I think what Emmanuel Macron wanted to say, or I would assess that he was not saying that Turkey should not speak to Russia.
No, he said not only Turkey. Yes.
He was saying that Europe should have been in the position as Turkey was to speak to Russia. But I think there was a misinterpretation. He did not say that Turkey was the bad player.
No.
He was, I think, advocating for the fact that Europe should be at the same level or the same capacity to speak. And maybe for some Europeans that worsens our position, because Emmanuel Macron confirmed the fact that he still wanted to speak to Vladimir Putin. In the same way, Recep Tayyip Erdogan is speaking to Putin and obtaining the 22 of July agreement on wheat, or assessing the fact that if there is a negotiation issue, it will mostly happen in Istanbul more than in Paris or in Brussels or in Berlin, and of course not in Washington. So I think it's important to have in mind that the position of French diplomacy since 1958 is very clear, is that we want to be an equilibrium power, or a non-alliant nation. General de Gaulle mentioned this very clearly when he made his speech in 1966. This was in Phnom Penh, in Cambodia, saying that France is not a non-aligned nation, it's a non-aligned power. It's the only non-aligned power, because we look in the same direction to Moscow, to Beijing, and to Washington. And this is very important, because I think in Europe we are the only ones to do this. Because we went out of NATO, we are the only country who went out of NATO in 1966. We came back, but we are the only ones to have done this. We came back in 2009. And so we have a special, let's say, global diplomatic approach, which is not Anglo-Saxon, which is more continental in a way. This is true when it comes to diplomacy, this is true when it comes to economic perspective, we are not a common law-based nation. We are a continental law-based nation. And this is true for economy, but this is true as well when it comes to diplomacy, or in the relations we have between civil society and states. I think what Emmanuel Macron said to the ambassador is that our diplomacy should be acute, agile, and of course take any opportunity to end wars. That does not mean the goal of diplomacy. That does not mean we should excuse or minor the responsibility of the ones who went to war.
So do you think Emmanuel Macron will manage to convince its European partners?
No. I'm interrupting you. No, because again, there is not the same mindset when it comes to discussing with Vladimir Putin when you are in France, or when you are in Latvia, or when you are in Poland, or when you are in Romania. Of course not.
Atât pentru astăzi, dar rămânem în continuare online pe pagina de Facebook a emisiunii și pe contul nostru de Twitter. Revenim cu subiecte noi din lumea diplomației și a politicii externe, vinerea viitoare de la 11:30 și reluare sâmbătă după miezul nopții.